Thank you very much for joining us on this COP26 Post-Match Analysis, what it means for the world and what it means for the UK. We've got a fantastic panel of speakers joining us today. We're going to start with Richard Black, who's an associate at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, to give an overview of what's happened at the COP, what was agreed. We'll then move on to Emma Pinchbeck, Chief Executive of Energy UK, who's going to give an overview of what the agreement actually means for UK and the business reaction to the summit. Next will be Chris Stark, Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee, who will take a bit more of a deeper dive into the UK context and how this agreement will impact on the UK and its next steps on this front. And finally, we'll go to Amber Rudd, former Secretary of State for Climate Change, who will give a broader political context to this agreement and what it means for the Prime Minister and the government going forward. Please could you submit any questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat box? And if you could please also state your name and the organisation that you're coming from, that would be great. We may have to coalesce some of the questions if they're covering the same topic, because we only have 1 hour for this webinar. So without further ado, I will hand over to Richard Black, who will start us off. Richard.
Yeah, thanks, Seppi. Hello, everyone. Nice to be here again with you. So just a few thoughts on what happened at COP26 and where it leaves us. I think the first thing to say about COP26 is that it happened. And if you think back a year, that wasn't actually certain that it would. Even if you think back 4 months or so, a lot of the debate was around logistics and quarantines and vaccines, with a lot of unhappiness from a number of governments. But it did happen, and that itself, I think, shows you that the vast majority of countries actually wanted it to happen. The majority sent leaders there as well as delegates and so on. So that, I think, is bearing in mind where we were is worth noting. And I hope that leaves something of a legacy in the UK of interest in this as a global issue. Broadcasters were able to interview people from every country. It's probably the last time they've been able to do that since the Olympics. And so I hope, that the concerns of people in Samoa and Togo and, myriad other developing countries will have been heard in the UK in a way they haven't been before, and hopefully that leaves a lasting legacy. And I think it will do something for the UK in the world as well, the fact that the UK actually did host this. And I think it's done something for Scotland and for Glasgow as well, because Scotland had a good COP, I think, and Glasgow had a good COP. It was a great place to be. So there's that. The second thing is that some of the expectations and the framing of Glasgow beforehand wasn't that great. The last chance stuff that we heard before, and we've heard for many occasions in the past. And this was about Boris getting a deal and Boris asking world leaders to do more and everything. It was all a bit vapid, to be honest. But I think by the time we got to the end of COP26, I think some of the coverage and so on was far more realistic and informed and factual and so on. So that was good. And again, I hope that's left a legacy of more realistic understanding of what these processes are about. So turning to what was actually delivered, this was supposed to be the sort of first turn of the ratchet mechanism to get countries to come back with more ambitious pledges. And on that, you'd have to say it didn't totally deliver. We did have some countries making more ambitious statements on the way to the summit. We had a few more ambitious ones at the summit, but we had others who went backwards. Brazil, for example, submitting a 2030 pledge that was actually worse than the one it had put in before, and a number of others not really stepping up at all. And I think that has actually got more to do with sort of populist politics and also geopolitics, frankly, in the case of China and so on, than it has to do with a lack of concern about climate change. Looking at the agreements themselves, one thing that comes through very strongly for me is the recognition of the seriousness and a recognition of the science. So the IPCC language on the necessary emissions cuts and so on is reflected abundantly in the text. Words like urgency, concern, these words are all over the text, which is quite something, I think. So a few things that were accomplished. The rule book is done. I'm not going to delve into any of these, but Article 6 on carbon trading, common timeframes for basically agreeing that all countries will put forward their new and hopefully increased pledges on the same timeframes was agreed. Transparency was agreed. So now every country has a better view of what everyone else is doing. 6 years after the Paris summit, these might seem like sort of tying off loose ends, but they're very important loose ends, actually, all of them. And it's just good to get it done, I think. In terms of, increasing the ambition of governments, I mean, as I said, the NDCs were basically a mixed bag. And we saw a few new pledges there. The Indian one caught the headline, both increasing ambition to 2030 and a net zero pledge by 2070. We had these side agreements on coal, cash, cars and trees, keep Allegra Stratton happy. And I think all of them sent a bit of a market signal, even though in every case, a lot of the detail was missing and some of the claims proved to be, a little bit extravagant when journalists and others actually started looking at what they actually meant. Nevertheless, they all have some meaning. I'm sure Emma will look at that meaning a little bit more in a minute. In the outcome documents, there's an expectation that governments need to come back next year and do better. Of course, it doesn't mean that all will, but nevertheless, that is in the text. There's been a lot of talk about the watering down of the language on coal phase out to phase down, and fossil fuel subsidies going to inefficient fuel subsidies. I think at the beginning of last week, if you'd have told any of us that we would have language on coal phase down and phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, we'd have bitten your hand off, frankly. And of course, China and India and some of the other big emerging economies didn't like the initial language. But that's what you kind of do in a negotiation. You go in with something ambitious, and if it has to be watered down, okay, it gets watered down. But if you don't try, you don't get anywhere. So I'm quite glass half full on that, to be honest with you. Where does it leave us in terms of emissions trajectories? Just to draw from the climate action tracker, it depends what you're looking at. And we had this unfortunate confusion in the first week of the COP with a couple of analyses saying, oh, we were on track to 1.8 or 1.9. Well, they didn't say that, they caveated it, but unfortunately it got written up as we're on track. So basically, according to climate action tracker, the sum total of policies and actions being taken by governments around the world puts us on track to about 2.7 Celsius. If you look at the ultra optimistic end of the scale and assume that governments fulfill every single pledge that they've ever made, then yes, 1.8 is feasible. And what I think this shows us is a couple of things. One is that in pledges, we are getting closer to 1.5. So what Climate Action Tracker call the pledges and targets trajectory is they now have 2.1 Celsius. And over the course of this year, that's dropped from 2.4 Celsius. So that shows you that at least in pledge terms, governments are coming up to the plate. But I think the other thing it shows you that if this decade has got to be about one thing, it's about solidifying pledges. We don't need more pledges. And I think the UK presidency got this. At the beginning of the year, it was all about we need to get governments coming forward with new net zero pledges. But, that's not really credible anymore. You need actions, policies. And just one final sobering thought from Climate Action Tracker, if you look at from the 2030 targets, basically, if that's all that gets fulfilled, we'll have twice as much CO2 emissions this decade as is compatible with the 1.5 Celsius trajectory. So an awful lot of solidification needing to be done. So turning to a couple of other things, adaptation, I think the key results here were the doubling of adaptation finance by 2025. I ended up having dinner on the Saturday night purely by chance next to some delegates from one of the small island states, and they were pretty happy about this. Solid outcome for them. There's going to be a global goal on adaptation finally, 6 years after it was pledged in the Paris Agreement. And serious talks are starting on that, so that's good. On climate finance, the short term, there was really nothing that could be done once we got to Glasgow about the shortfall in finance from developed countries, but it is at least acknowledged, with serious concern in the text. And long-term finance is quite an interesting outcome, I think. So basically, we've now got a sort of evidence gathering, views gathering process starting, asking for inputs from everyone. And they say, actually, especially from the private sector, which is quite interesting. And I think there's a recognition that the 100 billion or the next iteration of the 100 billion, that's not actually going to be enough anymore. We need much larger sums that are leveraged by mechanisms probably outside the UN Climate Convention that can put trillions, not billions, into this. And we heard some of this, talk of some of this at the conference with Mia Mottley, the Barbadian Prime Minister, talking about special drawing rights, for example, discussion in the wings of, could you quantitatively ease your way to solving climate change? I'm not an economist. I don't know whether any of that works, but I think it's really interesting that we are moving definitely on from just talking about 100 billion and so on. On loss and damage, this was where a lot of the smaller developing countries were quite unhappy. Basically, they've been fed up with this act being kicked into the long grass for forever. But I would say that there was definitely an advance here. The language in the agreement is explicit that climate, this is the phrase, climate change has already caused and will increasingly cause losses and damage to some of the poorer developing countries. We had a Christian Aid report come out on a week ago, which showed that basically, even if you get on to a 1.5 Celsius trajectory, you're looking at maybe 15% damage to the GDP of the poorest countries by 2050. And if we don't get onto that trajectory, then that would be double that much. So there's a dialogue, which they wanted a facility. We've got a dialogue, but it will lead, I think, to some kind of facility where the West actually has to start handing over some money, and hopefully that will concentrate minds on cutting emissions more and doing more on adaptation. So just three kind of takeaways for me. One, as I said, this is about delivery. It's about solidifying those pledges, and I think that means something for every country. Second thing is, if the UK and other Western countries want to put more pressure on China and India and Mexico and Brazil, they really need to get their house in order on finance and loss and damage, because China and India could justifiably point to the West's failure to delivery on those things. This is a very, very simple diplomatic ploy. Do what you've promised, and then you can get other people on your side. And the third thing, I think, is this idea of finance outside the United Nations Climate Convention. I think we're going to see a lot of interest in how to leverage money from the World Bank, from multilateral development banks, from the private sector. This is going to be a really big conversation, I think, over the next couple of years. So I'll leave it there. Back to you, Seppi.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Richard, for that brilliant overview. I'm going to hand over now to Emma Pinchbeck. Emma.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that we're not all going to violently agree with one another, so I'll try and pick up on the things that Richard didn't cover, or reinforce some of the things that he did. And on, let's start with the fossil fuel stuff. That's probably the most interesting thing for journalists if you're talking to someone in the energy sector. And Richard, I was reading back through some of the overnight briefings that came through each day of the week, and in the first week of Paris, there was a reference at first week of the negotiations. There was a reference to possibly getting coal phase out language into the text, and just utter dubiousness in the overnight briefing that we were going to get it. So I think, we all come to the end of the process tired. Everyone's tired at this point, and the cynicism is understandable. But just to start by reinforcing, I think there have been some things achieved, and certainly for the private sector, the overall signal is as important as the substance, because many of the CEOs I work with they're not going to go and read the UN agreement. They want to know what the overall take is. And if you think about Paris, there are still many voices that call Paris a failure, but in the 6 years since Paris, the market signal that the Paris Agreement drove basically undermined investment in large-scale fossil fuel infrastructure and helped drive the renewables transition and therefore the energy transition. And where I sit in the job that I do, Glasgow either was going to speed that transition up or keep it going as it is. There's certainly no sense in the energy sector that the transition away from fossil fuels to renewables is going to be slowing down. And so for me, the language in the text and the importance of it, I know this is heretical, but I don't particularly care whether it's urgent or requests or phase down or phase up. The fact that we've got language on coal and on fossil fuel subsidies is a really, really strong market signal. And you can tell that because OPEC are kicking off about it on Twitter. So it's the joy in my week this week. So that it's got a powerful market signal, crucially and most powerfully to investors. And so my second point is Richard's one around finance. Look, it's actually not in my job description to talk to governments about where they didn't succeed. You know, I think about the business community, but I think it is a huge own goal to do things like cut aid budgets in the run-up to a climate conference. Those of us that have done multiple COPs know that it often hinges on that delicate diplomatic balance between rich countries and poor countries, and it's a sign of good faith that rich countries are moving the money, and in return, therefore, India, China, and rapidly developing economies agreeing to higher ambition language around things like coal. And so I think if the UK presidency next year wants to get NDCs tightened, we should be talking to exchequers globally as well as to negotiators and trying to get that money moving. Now, from the point of view of the private sector, I'm pretty confident that the market signals will drive a lot of private sector investment into not just the UK economy, but other economies internationally. And when I think about climate finance and what we can do for developing countries, I am, though, very conscious that if we get that right, you can help UK exports. So just to give you an example, in my previous line of work, when I was doing lots of work with the global offshore wind industry, I ran out of the number of times that I spoke to developing country governments who came to us asking for advice on building offshore wind, onshore wind and solar, but were often held up by the fact that export credit financing and aid budgets were still going towards fossil fuels from wealthier nations. And so that shift will not just help those countries, it will help us export our renewables industry to other countries. Apart from the shift in government finance, I'm very, very interested to work with financial institutions and see what we can do, as Rich is saying, to create other frameworks outside of the UN to get that money moving. The other thing I think to touch upon is the rule book and the side deals. Now, the rule book, the thing to mention is that we are a bit disappointed, and I speak as business here, we're a bit disappointed with the carbon markets decisions, particularly around the rules on offsetting. That's great, we have a rule book, and it's great we have transparency for the first time, but I think we'll want to make sure that as we implement those rules, that companies and countries that are genuinely decarbonising and using offsets as a last resort and not being cheated by companies who are doing the wrong thing and using offsets and not going for mitigation. So, and that's particularly important for the energy sector, particularly the power sector, who are moving their businesses. And so we'll want to be rewarded for that. The other thing more generally to mention about carbon markets is when you don't have clear rules or where you're using lots of credits, it can often undermine the price. And having a strong price signal and a very liquid market is the thing that then drives financial investment. So it's also just important for the functioning of the market. So that's a wait and see. And then lastly, business was there. I should have started with this, but business was there. And I've done lots of COP, well, lots, not as many as Richard, several COPs. And my observation about doing this one with business rather than with civil society is just how genuine and how significant the business presence was there. And I saw, you know, everyone on this call in various different rooms talking to leaders in the business community, and someone said to me, the CEOs are here and that's how you know it's serious. It's not like the PR teams or the finance directors, it's the CEOs. And I can genuinely say hand on heart that business was there trying to drive ambition in the deal, because they are further ahead than governments. They're further ahead than governments on understanding climate risk and wanting that kind of properly captured in the text, but also further ahead than governments in financing the transition and moving. And they were frustrated by the lack of ambition too. So they were all over the side agreements where they could participate, unlike, you know, in the formal negotiations. And so again, there are lots of holes in those side agreements. They're more pledges than action, but I would be very surprised if the pledges didn't drive a similar sort of ambition from business as we saw after Paris, where they'll pay attention to the headlines. So in particular, the work on methane, very, very important, given what we are starting to see about the side effects from traditional fossil fuel activities of methane, but also, you know, making decisions about things like blue and green hydrogen, how we do that safely, you know, so having an eye on methane, very important. The transport pledges, again, important because the UK, world leading in that space with our electrification target, will have EV manufacturing here. So again, positive to see that. And the deforestation, pledge, less my space, but I think interesting because it was years in the making. The guys who look at land use change and things like offsetting were very happy with it. And I think, again, for business trying to join up all the spaces that they work in, which and they do, you know, many of them will be looking at things like offsets or have big supply chains where they'll be looking at things like deforestation down the piece. I think, again, a really strong signal about the way the global economy is going. So I suppose to finish, someone said last week, if anyone thinks that the world now changes with, you know, 200 diplomats sat in a room, they're bonkers. The point of this process is to get a framework that drives real world change. And for me, nothing has changed in our overall strategy in business apart from a doubling down on ambition. I think for the UK, the fact we've got to get everyone back to the table next year means it's not time to take the foot off the electric car, foot off the gas. That's a terrible analogy. We've got to keep going. And that's how I feel about it on Monday morning. 2 cups of coffee down. But yeah, there you go. Thank
you so much, Emma. It's always fantastic to have your input and hear your insights. So we're going to move on to Chris Stark, please. Chris.
Thanks, Seppi. Thanks to Richard and Emma as well. And I agree with everything that's been said so far. So I won't recover all of it. But just a few reflections from me. It's the first COP that I've been to where I've spent the full 2 weeks there. So I've jetted in and out with ministers in the past when I was a civil servant, and you don't get a sense of how the COP really goes until you're there. And I find that fascinating. You see this sort of narrative as it plays out over the 2 weeks. And particularly interesting to me because I'm in Glasgow. I'm still here. I'm the only one left. So you've all left me. But to me, it felt like a good process, and certainly in terms of the outcome, it's not perfect, but I think it is a genuinely good progression. And coming into it, I wasn't sure we would have that. So some overall reflections for me on it. I said this to Roger Harbin last week, and I noted he'd said it on Twitter as well, but it felt like the COP that we should have had 20 years ago, which is an easy thing to say. But the reason I say that is because, of course, civil society made its voice heard, as it always does. But so did business, just as Emma said. So you get this kind of interesting moment, really, where world leaders are now being squeezed on both sides because the business is pushing. They want to see more ambition. Not all businesses, of course, but we saw a huge amount of momentum from commerce to tackle some of the big issues for the first time. And I think that's because the economics are in a much better place for decarbonisation than they've ever been. So that, I think, is a really good omen of what will come after Glasgow. One of the innovations, of course, in Glasgow was the sectoral side deals that we've heard a lot about. And I think they did work, actually. We had a lot of positive momentum in that first week. That was very much a UK-led thing. That was an innovation from the UK team. And I think it will stick in future COPs. At least I hope it will. And the key thing here is that, you know, of course, we can examine each of those and their own merits. And of course, there are different, you know, ambitions and of different quality and vintage. But I think in general, they give the world leaders more confidence that we can be ambitious and that there is this momentum to decarbonise. There's such a strong signal. Methane, coal, deforestation, all the others. They were all pretty good in the round, slightly underwhelming perhaps on transport. I was personally quite annoyed about the overheated finance announcement, the $130 trillion. You know, it might as well have been, you know, $1 gazillion. It just felt too much. But other than that, I think everything else worked really well, actually. So, I mean, from my perspective, what matters is the impact on the climate. So in terms of the overall outcomes, looking at the mitigation stuff, especially, we went into Paris, as you've heard, well over 3 degrees centigrade as the central projection. We will leave Glasgow with a projection that's realistically something that's near 2.5. So there is clearly something happening now. And there is this path to lower temperature outcomes, the 1.8 degrees centigrade, which at the time it came from, you remember, it was Melbourne University said something about it, then the IEA did. I slightly slack-jawed when I saw that, but actually all of the commentators aligned behind that. The numbers do add up. To get to those kind of really low numbers, though, you need certain conditions to be in place, and they're not in place. So the big step forward is in long-term net zero goals. 90% of the world economy now under a net zero goal. That's got to be seen as huge progress. Of course, we can question whether all of those goals are, you know, as tight as the one that we have in the UK, but amazing to talk in that way about it. The sectoral deals, as we've talked about, will also have some impacts. Not clear quite how much additionality there is there. But then there's the NDCs, the 2030 targets. These are really the gold standard, and they aren't in the right place. Very clearly, they're not in the right place to be anywhere close to that 1.5 degree trajectory that was talked about so much. Clear recognition, though, coming out of this, that the next decade is now the critical thing. And I think that it's really important to say that. We weren't talking that way about 2030 being so important until this moment. Glasgow, of course, couldn't sort 2030 commitments. It never was going to sort them because countries don't come armed to make those new commitments. We saw the India commitment and a few others, but mostly that happened prior to Glasgow. And it was always going to be that. You saw the limits of diplomacy. I was in the room at the gavel. You could see how much the UK process had squeezed all the parties. I think Glasgow achieved as much as it possibly could. So just on the international outcomes, 1.5 degrees now clearly recognised as the aim. Super clear on the science of that. Explicit reference in the text of the Glasgow agreement to cut emissions by 45% by 2030. That's amazing. The big step forward is requesting these strengthened NDCs next year. I don't think you can understate how important that is. It wasn't guaranteed that the UK could get that kind of mechanism in place. Huge piece of diplomacy there. We've called out coal, we've called out fossil fuels for the first time ever. I don't particularly care whether it's phase down or phase out. It's really important that there's a piece of text with that has that in it. We've sorted out the rule book. We've doubled adaptation finance. We've almost got that $100 billion landed now. And loss and damage, which of course moved over the course of the last few days from being a new facility to being a new dialogue. There is now a proper process in place, and that will set up the Egypt COP to really look at that. So all of that, I think you've got to see as a really important set of steps forward. When it comes to the UK, just lastly on that, we're going to give some advice in the next 2 or 3 weeks on the post-COP landscape and where we stand, and crucially, what it means for the UK. So just a few things to say on that. Really important thing, which I was saying to a colleague just the other day, that new commitments are not made at the COP. We've seen that by and large. The COP is really there to measure the progress that we've made. It's really in the period prior to the COP that you really do the hard miles. So I think that is an important thing to have in our minds when it comes to the fact that the UK presidency of the COP actually begins in Glasgow. So we will hold it for 12 months. We have not really seen that has been a meaningful thing in previous COPs. So notably in Paris, the French kind of diplomacy started to sort of disintegrate after the Paris Agreement was made. Now, I think this needs to be the COP where we actually take the presidency seriously over the next 12 months. So that, I think, points to the importance of the UK presidency in gingering up these new commitments that were hard fought in that new mechanism. So that next 12 months, hopefully, will bring about much more ambition in global agreements for 2030, and the UK can play a big part in that. In terms of beyond that, what the UK can do, for me, this delivery stuff, we've got to be demonstrating now that the UK can offer a successful template for decarbonising, that we can implement the policies that we've seen in the new net zero strategy. I'm not at the moment thinking that next year the UK will be tabling new 2030 emissions targets. It does feel like we have reached a point here where all of the advice that we've given on emissions targets was drawn on a 1.5 degree pathway. But perhaps there are other ways in which the UK can express more ambition, and especially through that international effort I talked about. But the other thing I'll just lastly say on this, really interesting to see amongst all of the declarations and announcements last week, the one I was particularly interested in was this political declaration on the just energy transition in South Africa, which was with UK, France, EU, and I think Germany was in there as well, pointing to the idea that we in the UK might be able to help with a bit of what you might typically call capacity building to generate faster transitions elsewhere. And I think that kind of increased ambition we can express perhaps in different ways than just setting harder emissions targets. So we're going to do some work on that, but I think it points to quite an interesting 12 months for the UK.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. Really, really brilliant to get your thoughts on that. Now, last but not least, I'm going to hand over to Amber Rudd. Amber.
Thank you so much, Seppi. And it's been great to hear from Richard, Chris and Emma with their thoughts. So I'll try to cover a different angle. I remember so well in cabinet, and Claire Perry, who was Minister for Energy at the time, brought back this idea that the UK should host the significant COP. Sometimes people think that these sort of COPs happen every year, they do up to a point, but this one was always going to be the significant one. And there was a fairly strong pushback from the Treasury that never likes to have an expense thrust at it, even though it's a few years away. But it was seized on by most of us, and particularly by Theresa May, because as we'd left the EU, or were indeed leaving, however you care to look at it, we needed some way to show that the UK had an important role on the world stage. And this was seen as an ideal way to do it. And from that perspective, I think the UK did pretty well. I think that the COP itself, I take it from the comment from Chris, who said that this was the best one we could have had under those circumstances. And it's worth remembering that these COPs can go wrong. We very quickly bank the relative success of a COP, but there are plenty in the past that did go wrong, that fell apart at one route or another. So in terms of the UK's politics, I think that its ambition to show that it could convene this, given that there's been some, shall we say, international criticism of some of the UK government's positions, has been successful from the point of view of international politics. And that I think that most of us will welcome. And in terms of how it structured the COP, I think it's worth picking up on a couple of the comments that previous speakers made about how it differed and how, relatively speaking, I think they were successful. I mean, just to pick up immediately on the last point that Chris made about South Africa, this was an unusual approach to have effectively a sort of try to bilateral event where the UK, the US and the EU had a particular approach and deal with South Africa in terms of helping them deliver on a green economy with money attached to it. I thought that was interesting, and I think we will see more of that. I thought in the first week, those side deals that arrived with quite quick succession about coal, cars, cash and trees, was well done. It was well done, even though they were slightly unpicked the next day. They had some genuine content. And the one I would particularly pick out as being encouraging was on trees, particularly because the equivalent that had been done in 2014 in New York didn't have the same amount of money attached to it. And if there's one theme that really comes out loud and clear from this COP, it's about money. These pledges, these ambitions, the delivery that Chris emphasizes can only happen with the money. And so the Trees Declaration had the money attached, which is what really distinguishes it and hopefully can make it successful. It was good to see businesses there, as Emma said. I found it slightly peculiar that the energy businesses weren't there, the oil and gas businesses, but I can see why they weren't. After their first few days there, that most of the chief executives had planned on coming up to a couple of weeks before, but then decided that perhaps they wouldn't have as pleasant an encounter as other chief executives, so decided not to. At the core of it, though, this was a government-to-government big meeting in order to agree 190 countries, 195 countries on one text. And it's worth just digesting that to think how incredibly ambitious that is. And the danger you always have in that of one or two countries pulling it down, so you end up with the lowest common denominator. And just to reflect, when we went into Paris 6 years ago, we had exactly that fear. As the UK and the EU, we were concerned that US and China were going to stitch up a low ambition deal. In the end, they didn't, but partly because the brilliantly run presidency by the French at the time inserted the 1.5 degrees very much at the last minute. And there was such a strong push from small island nations that it stayed in. My view is that we've got an agreement now in Glasgow, which is more ambitious than many of us had hoped for 6 years ago, but not ambitious enough given the evidence that's around us. And this is one of the other big distinctions between Glasgow and Paris. Those of us in Paris felt that it was more niche addressing dangerous climate change than the democratization that we've got now, which Greta is partly responsible for, where everybody wants an outcome. To a certain extent, nobody wants to pay for it, but everybody wants an outcome. And the governments had to come to some sort of agreement, and that sort of popular pressure around us in Glasgow felt very real. Just a final word, if I may, about the politics in the UK. I mean, talking to other countries, I'm always amazed at the fact that the UK is pretty unusual with its cross-party agreement on ambitious targets, with the Committee on Climate Change, which Chris, of course, is the chief executive for, which does so much to hold governments to account, our government to account, with the carbon budgets to make sure that we can't just do it all in the future. I heard a new phrase from Ed David the other day, which I don't know whether everybody else is acquainted with. It's called NIMTO, not in my term of office. And not that he was using it for himself, but just that the carbon budgets will stop the UK, I think, falling into that danger. So the politics in the UK, I think, are pretty robust. And the other piece of news, good news, I think, in the UK, is that Boris Johnson has landed, in a way, on the green industrial revolution as his primary purpose, as the #1 issue on his agenda, because it delivers on the other elements on his agenda, on levelling up, on good green jobs, on UK having a leadership in other areas, particularly in green technology. So from that point of view, we are fortunate, we are aligned, the government is aligned with what the country needs to do. And I think Glasgow will continue to give it that success to do so. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Amber. That was really interesting perspective on the UK politics going forward. Right, we've got a number of questions in the Q&A box and we have under 20 minutes to do it. So I'm going to group a couple of them. So we have Luke Murphy from IPPR and Jeffrey Lean, long-time environment and climate journalist, and Caroline Lucas, MP for the Green Party, asking questions about what should the UK be doing in the next 12 months. Caroline specifically asks about the fossil fuel phase out and what is the best next step, and broader presidency work that needs to be done in the run-up to Egypt. So a couple of you have pointed towards that. Chris, would you like to take that question first?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say, and I've mentioned it already, but I'll say it again. We were debating before the COP whether we wanted to do a kind of stock take afterwards. And at the time, I was thinking the most useful thing that we could do is probably, you know, reach some sort of consensus position on what the numbers were telling us after the COP. Actually, the 4 or 5 analysts that have looked at it have all converged on the numbers anyway. So we will do something on, we decided during the COP that we would do this stock take thing afterwards, but it won't be, I think, focused on the projections for the climate. It will be more about what the UK presidency can do over the next 12 months, kind of working with that idea that there is actually quite a lot to play for still, and that the UK is in a pretty unique position to encourage that greater international ambition that we would all like to see, of course. So we'll do a piece of work on that, which I think is legitimate. We're asked to think about international circumstances in the Climate Change Act. So we're going to do that before Christmas, actually, hopefully by the end of this month. One of the things that we'll look at is this question of how the UK itself can express ambition. So we'll come back to that, of course. But then the other thing we're planning to do after that is in the early weeks of next year, offer a piece of advice on oil and gas. So we've not typically had a look at oil and gas, but we now have a piece of evidence that will help us to do that in the form of the International Energy Agency's report on 1.5 degrees. This is the first occasion we've had to actually process that properly and look at the implications for oil and gas supply. That's the first time we've done a piece of advice like that. We've looked at fracking before, but we haven't looked at the oil and gas supply issues in the round for the UK. So I'm sure that will be a controversial and interesting thing when we publish it. But I'm quite excited about looking at that, because for me, it's the final piece of the jigsaw for us, that we've always thought about fossil fuel supply in terms of what the Climate Change Act requires, which is looking at the territorial borders of the UK. And that leads you to a particular outlook of, don't burn it in the UK. I think we need to think in a more global sense about all of this now. I don't think there's any real reason to continue to have a too narrow an outlook on it. So that we've now got the evidence to support that, and I think that will be one of the more interesting things we publish next year. But the last thing for me, there is so much still to do after COP. It doesn't just end in Glasgow. And I'm actually quite excited about all of that. So we have nice, the pieces are in a good place in the UK for us to tell a continuing good story to others about how to do this well, and also to be in a position of influence to change some of those international issues that I talked about earlier.
Thank you very much, Chris. I will then move on to the question from Tom Sass from the Institute for Government, asking, what did speakers make of the EU's role at COP26? If you agree with the criticisms, what explains that and what are the implications? Now, I may ask Richard and Amber to come in on that. Richard, would you like to make a few remarks first?
Sure. I mean, I think it's true, Tom, what your question implies, that the EU didn't play much of a role at COP26. I mean, Timmermans made a few speeches at the end, but it wasn't clear that level of sort of of speechifying was matched by solid stuff behind the scene. I think it's for a range of reasons. France is busy with an election. Germany's just had an election, and the new government is still being formed. So those two countries are obviously in a limited position to play a role. But I think I have to flag up Brexit here as an issue. In a non-Brexit world, 3 or 4 years ago, the relations between the EU and the UK would have been evolving differently. When the UK had the COP announced, the normal thing would have been to go to the French, go to the Germans, go to the other influential European governments and say, okay, let's work together. How can you do this? Germany, could you take on, maybe talk to China? France, could you look at the finance piece? Whatever it is, this is what the French did, as Amber knows better than me, before 2021, but it wasn't really possible. So, and we had these rows over fishing and stuff like this, so which probably made it politically, for example, for Macron to be saying, oh, I'm going to work with Johnson on this thing. So that was all a bit unfortunate. I think the EU is not totally united itself in terms of its direction of travel, and frankly, its big issue is delivering its Fit for 55 package. There's stacks of bits of legislation and regulation and so on that have to be got through. So I think all of those probably played a role. But just to one of the other questions is about what the UK needs to do over the next year. One of those things is actually to repair relations on this issue with the EU, because if you want to influence governments like Australia, for example, carbon border adjustment mechanism is probably one of the best tools we have in the box at the moment.
Thank you, Richard, and over to Amber.
Yes, thank you, Seppi. I agree with a lot of what Richard said. Basically, it's the politics of where the UK is with the EU that meant that we didn't work together on this. When in Paris 6 years ago, when the French had the presidency, the EU worked very much as one unit and with a loud voice. And that was partly because the UK was such an active player in the EU. But I feel like I lost that argument a few years ago. So we've got to live in the world that we've got, which is that the EU has lost the strength of having the UK at the heart of it to try and shape as an active participant in it. And it also has its own problems that it's fighting over at the moment, and its own slight, let's face it, anomalies in terms of its own supplies of energy. But the whole issue of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which we all know is coming, they were determined not to raise, not to talk about, because it is so controversial with vulnerable countries. So I think probably one of the reasons that we didn't hear from them was also because that flagship policy wasn't for discussion at the COP, so they largely kept their heads down in this respect.
Thank you very much, Amber. Moving on to a question from Madeline Cuff. Are there risks to the blame game that is played out regarding India and China? Does it risk that they're less likely to submit more ambition next year? Thank you. Amber, would you like to come back in on that quickly? Just
very briefly, Seppi. I think it was an extraordinary thing. But as I said, what happened in Paris is the last minute, the deal was escalated up. And at this time, at the last minute, the deal was pushed down. Everybody's tired, they need to get a settlement, somebody digs in, and China and India digging in together, that's quite a powerful group. So I think it was a depressing outcome, but I don't think it's the essence of the deal. But I think the significance is them just showing their muscle.
Thank you very much, Amber. A question from Adam. Adam, the first part of your question was actually answered in the initial contributions about the change in the language and the market signals on coal. But I'll move on to your second question, which is countries promised to come back next year with 1.5 degree aligned NDCs. How likely do you think that this will happen? Who would like to take that? Richard, yeah.
Yeah, I can have a go at that. I think it's not so much, Adam, that countries promised to come back next year. It's that the countries are invited to do that. So will they? Just running down a quick list, I think the EU, US, very unlikely. They feel they've already made their pledges, and actually their priority should be to get stuff done that they've pledged already. China, very unlikely. I think given the geopolitics. India, very unlikely. They'll feel they've made their contribution here. I think the opportunity lies in some other countries. The opportunities lies, South Africa, for example. If this deal goes through on coal, why not? Why not do that? Brazil has an election next year. Australia has an election next year. Those are two countries that are way off the pace on their NDCs. The South Africa deal gives us, other countries to explore. What about something with Indonesia? What about something with the Philippines? What about something with Thailand? These governments actually that probably can do a bit more, provided that the right kind of offer is made. So one of the things that struck me about this South Africa thing is that there's an opportunity there, and it's a kind of targeted intervention where the politics and the situation creates that possibility. So, in terms of what the presidency could be looking at for the year, I think that's one of those things. Where are these other opportunities for similar deals?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Richard. Moving on to a question from Hannah Seychelles. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name. She asks, if anyone is in any doubt about the investors issue, go back to the investor agenda official and COP26 side event. Excuse me, sorry, it's a few technical issues here. Does anyone think we will see big investors lean in with governments regarding shifting the export finance away from fossil fuels in much the way they engage with big emitters via the Climate Action 100+? And is it possible that they could press or persuade the UK presidency to signal fundamental shift, call out the G20 to change on this before the end of the COP26 presidency? Emma.
Yeah, it's got my name in the question. By the way, before I answer it, can I just say, Seppi, to you and Richard, and on behalf of everyone at COP, you guys must be absolutely broken. You've done so much media over the last 2 weeks, so thank you for your efforts. I'm not surprised your laptop's giving up, Seppi. I'm amazed that you haven't also. So
thank you. I'm starting to slow. Apologies for that.
And actually, again, for any journalists on the call, I think that thing about tiredness towards the end, as Amber said, really does change how people feel about the outcome. And if you ask us again in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, that will be when we start to really see what the impact of the Glasgow Pact really is. Right now, I think everyone is a bit broken. That's just the way it is. On the financing, look, so for me, it was already on my to-do list. I can't tell you exactly what we'll be doing, but because we're still talking about it, but basically in the UK, Energy UK, possibly the Green Finance Institute and several other investors are getting together because I will tell you that quite often where there are now barriers to things like someone asked about energy efficiency rollout or heat decarbonisation, it's often in the financial model and the ability to get investment in and the cost of investment rather than it is about the policy design necessarily or the willingness of industry to move. So we already have projects in place to try and unlock new kinds of capital and new kinds of investment into the market, and to get the energy industry, who know a lot about what's happening in the technologies, together with investors who are enthused but maybe don't have the same knowledge we do about the pace of change. And I can commit, in the UK that we'll be doing that. I'm sure other national energy agencies and energy companies will be doing the same in their own country. I just wanted to say something else about the finance, which is it struck me through the negotiations that exchequers are going to be key to the next year. So we can't just allow this to be kind of taken forward by energy ministries or seen as a kind of climate change problem that happens over here. it is largely about money and confidence in investment. And when you've seen governments, India's reluctance on coal at the last minute was about steel, I think, and their confidence in decarbonising steel. And fundamentally, that comes back to your belief in having available technologies and money for the transition. And if you can get exchequers to see properly that investing in low carbon technologies and solutions is an economic opportunity, you'll move the ambition to. And just in the UK, I would say that our own Treasury doesn't yet realise that tackling climate change is the future economy. They sort of still treat it as an adjunct to it. And Caroline Lucas has also asked about institutional change. I really genuinely believe that we need some change in how we do the evaluation of our policy frameworks and how we allocate our fiscal and monetary policy against country objectives. Now that's longer than a year. We won't be able to do that in a year, but I'd love to see the Treasury kind of grasp that problem in the UK and to start to look at it, as well as, in the private sector. I guarantee you that large investors will be now starting to look at climate risk and opportunities here and internationally.
Thank you, Emma. I'm going to pass over to Amber. And Amber, if you could address that question about the Treasury that's been put by Fiona Deer as well, is that how high will they have this on their agenda?
The Treasury will be hoping that if they get the right policies, the private sector does most of the heavy lifting. Mm-hmm. And that's why they announced, for instance, the abandoning of new internal combustion engine cars by 2030. And of course, that is exactly what happens. If you set out a very clear policy, then the private sector will deliver. So that's what they will be gaming, rather than how many billions they need to invest, which they will try not to be doing. And I share Emma's view that it's not top of their agenda, really, at the moment. But just finally, if I may, on the whole issue of what's the outcome of Glasgow, and is it going to trigger what we really need, which is major investment to transform our industrial base, not just in the UK, but internationally? I think the jury's still out on that, and we will know, I don't know, weeks, months, whether this was a critical moment where the phrase that Emma used was confidence, whether the financial markets now have confidence to really put in the money that's going to be necessary to transform our industrial base. And it feels like it could be, but everyone's looking at everybody, everyone's trying to control the narrative, and we will see. But that's what will be really transformational, is if private sector money really pours into changing our industrial base.
Thank you very much, Amber. We are fast running out of time. For those of you whose questions have not been answered, please feel free to send an email to the info@eciu.net inbox, and we will try to our very best to get responses back to you. I just want to give each of the panelists 30 seconds to just give their final thoughts or final takeaway from this this climate summit. And if I start with you, Richard, take it away.
Yes, I think, as I was saying earlier, I hope that this has left in the UK a kind of legacy of increased interest in climate change and knowledge about climate change, and the kind of reason why net zero is there, and the reason why we're doing this kind of transition. The other part of the piece is, which Emma and Amber have referred to, as the kind of opportunity. And I do think the continuity of this process into next year, which Chris mentioned, is absolutely vitally important. There is a real opportunity, I think, to work with the Egyptian presidency over the next year, bring together the concerns of the least developed countries and the concerns of Europe, work out ways to jointly put pressure on, countries like Russia and the Saudis that are not seriously engaged with this agenda, and frankly, to put pressure on the US to deliver something like its fair share of climate finance. And I'm just hoping that the UK government, has internalized that this is a massive opportunity diplomatically and economically, and actually just gets on and does that.
Thank you, Richard. Over to you, Emma.
So on the logic, and I try not to. I think I tweeted this last week. I think you have to hang on to the sorry to be naff, but the emotional anger on behalf of countries that will be badly impacted by 1.5 degrees. Vulnerable people in places all around the world for whom it's not just a number; it's the survival of their cultures, and the young people who feel that we're not doing enough, because that does drive ambition, and on the substance, this is not enough. And I don't want to give anyone a free pass, right? So there's that. On the other hand, intellectually, there's a lot in Glasgow that we can work with, and I need to go back and talk to my members and see how they feel. But my general feeling from industry, where a lot of the money will sit to do this, where the transition is happening at pace, is that it was a step forward, and that business will continue to put pressure on government to do more. And if that isn't a flip around that from the last 6 years, and that has resulted from the Paris Agreement, actually, I don't know what else is. So I think there's been a real step on. And for me, that language on fossil fuels and coal is a fairly extraordinary achievement, actually. And I think we'll come back and look at that. And it seems mad to say it, that that it's taken us 30 years to get it in a UN agreement, but it does show you that I think everyone involved now, as Amber said, realises this is an issue. So I guess to finish answering, Laurie's question, I genuinely feel that countries understand the threat of climate change now, physically, because of the impacts we've seen, but also in terms of the social pressure outside and the financial pressure from businesses. And that is fundamentally different. So I don't believe, unlike at Copenhagen, for all the holes in the agreements, that it will fall off a cliff. To answer someone else's question, I think we've got to keep going. And the UK, both because of the presidency and because the Prime Minister has staked his political capital on it, this is not one of those agendas that finishes now at the end of the year. And for me, actually, that's a really positive outcome of Glasgow. We as the UK have got at least another year of this to go to really lead the charge towards 1.5 degrees. But I'm excited. I'm excited on a purely biased perspective, because in business now I get to be, an agent, hopefully, of closing that gap. And I suppose that's what I'll be doing when I stop being on holiday and go back to work next week.
Thank you so much, Emma. And over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Seppi. So a few words from me, really, just to close it off. I mean, I am positive about the outcome from Glasgow, and we've talked a lot about the extent to which I think actually the closing few minutes have clouded some of the coverage of this is something I'm sure we'll come to reflect on in the next few months. The agreement, the Glasgow Climate Pact, as it came to be known, is really strong. It's got some really strong language in there, and as many others have said, the very fact that we have got the science in there now, reference to fossil fuels, reference to coal, all that stuff is good. I thought my final point, really, was just to bring a bit of reality to this discussion. So I can just about get on board with the 1.5 alive stuff, but only just. And I think I've said this to several journalists, I don't mind saying it again, it is hanging by a thread. There is in play, I think, a realistic pathway to something like 1.7, 1.6 today. 1.5 is a huge ask. So 98 months to cut emissions by 45% is broadly what needs to be pulled out if we want to keep 1.5 in train. It will slip out of view in the next few years. So it's important to say that. And that means, coming back to the UK, we need to spend the next 12 months calling out the nations that didn't up their 2030 game. So that's Russia, that's China, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, definitely Australia. And these are the countries that need most urgent attention, because they haven't got targets that are anywhere close to the projection that we need if we want to keep 1.5 on the table. Now, if 1.5 does slip out of view, and I desperately hope it doesn't, then we'll focus on 1.6, and then we'll focus on 1.7. We're going to keep going on this. It doesn't stop. But the key thing is that this agreement creates that kind of mechanism. So, of course, it's not everything that we need, but we've got to get real about this, because the next 12 months is absolutely critical if you want that 1.5 pathway to stay alive.
Thank you, Chris. And that framing it in terms of 98 months really does focus the mind, doesn't it? Because every single month counts. Exactly. And finally, over to Amber Rudd. Amber.
Thank you, Seppi. Well, just to say, I was very much moved by Obama's words, which were advising young people to stay angry, get busy, and use your vote. And it's just a reminder that the public need to stay urgently engaged now, so that the politicians do the right thing, because they won't do the right thing, what we all around here believe to be the right thing, if it's in the teeth of their public, also known as their voters, views. Otherwise, you sink back to politicians know what to do, they just don't know how to get re-elected after they've done it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Amber, Emma, Chris, Richard for their fantastic thoughts. I'm very sorry that we didn't have enough time to answer all of the questions. If your question was not answered, please do send an email to the info@eciu.net box, and we will do our utmost to get an answer back to you, either from our own experts or indeed from the panelists, if they have time as well, within the next 24 or to 48 hours, but hopefully within the next day. Thank you very much. There will be a recording of this. You can also request that via the info box. But thank you very much indeed. And for those of you who are exhausted after COP, get some sleep.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.